Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. In Hong Kong, Richard Cullen is my name, and I'm the convener of the Tax Law Research Program, and especially this seminar series. And we're very lucky to have today Archie Parnell doing a presentation on taxation and climate change, something that I did some work on myself quite a few years ago, and it's a topic that's not going to go away. It's very important. Let me just say at the outset that this seminar will be recorded, so you can come back to it and look at it later. It'll be up online within a few days. And also the PowerPoints which Archie will be using, these will also be made available, so you can access them later if you wish to. And we'll let all of those who've enrolled know that this is available. In fact, I've just met Archie Parnell, although I had certainly heard of him before. Archie teaches 2 courses at the Law School of the Jindal Global University in India. And actually, I know somebody, Raj Kumar.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, who
the Vice Chancellor.
He's the Vice Chancellor. And Raj and I were actually colleagues together many years ago at City University of Hong Kong Law School. So please pass on my best wishes. Archie teaches 2 courses at that new and flourishing law school, relatively new law school, A Tale of Two Tax Systems and How Taxation can help address climate change, which we'll be focusing on today. His research interests include international tax policy, climate change tax, cross-border tax disputes, and so on. He's published in law reviews ranging from The Tax Lawyer to the Yale Law Journal. Before academia, Archie was a trial attorney at the Tax Division of the US Department of Justice and on the staff of the Ways and Means Committee of the US House of Representatives. He held senior tax roles at Exxon, Cudert Brothers, and Goldman Sachs in the US, Europe, and Asia. He's also served on various tax committees and advisory boards, including the OECD's Business and Investment Advisory Committee. In Hong Kong, he was a member of the Board of Review for 10 years. He was also chair of the Capital Markets Tax Committee of Asia for multiple years and participated in the Hong Kong Joint Liaison Tax Committee during that time. Enough from me. Welcome, Archie. Welcome to Hong Kong U and to this seminar. And looking forward to what you have to say. We'll have time for Q&A and hopefully we'll have you back again at some stage.
Well, thank you, Richard, for those kind remarks. I appreciate it. I'm honored to be here. Years ago, I was privileged to give a lecture on tax treaties to one of Andrew Hawkyard's tax classes here at HKU, and I remember the students as being very polite. I've always been fond of HKU, and I now have noticed that HKU law is highly ranked in 2025 at 15th in the world. It's very, very impressive, and I'm delighted to be here today with you, Professor Cullen. You mentioned your earlier work. You edited a book entitled Green Taxation in East Asia. So people sometimes ask me how taxation is related to climate change. And it's a good question because they don't seem to go together very, very well to most people. But taxes are the lever we use to steer the economy. Taxes can incentivize the shift away from greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why taxation should be a critical part of any conversation of climate change. And I also say that because I'm a tax lawyer. The foundation for my presentation today will be set by examining international agreements in the climate and environmental sphere, including the Montreal Protocol, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement. The seminar will consider commitments that countries made under the Paris Agreement to submit emission reduction pledges known as nationally determined contributions. Thereafter, the seminar will briefly examine carbon taxes, emissions trading systems, which are like carbon taxes and set a price for carbon. We will also consider the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a tariff, and tariffs are such in the news these days, unfortunately, with what's happening in the United States. We'll also examine subsidies that encourage, as well as tax subsidies that discourage climate mitigation. So there's a lot of material here, and I hope I can rush through it and not be so blurred about it. But we will give it a go to cover these topics. We will conclude by trying to describe using principles used by articulated by the IMF, the OECD, and other commentators as to what is a good tax and what is a bad tax in the climate mitigation area. I should note that the brochure for this webinar was released before President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, which is the second time in doing so, and we will discuss implications of his withdrawal for the future. Now, given that I was born in the United States, I feel I can look at the United States with a critical eye and poke at some fun at what's going on. So let's start off with a joke about climate change and taxation. Is that even possible? I'm not sure this is going to be funny, but I'm going to try. A climate scientist, a tax lawyer, and a bewildered tourist from Hong Kong don't walk into a bar, but instead walk into a congressional hearing. The scientist says, "We need urgent action on climate change." The tax lawyer says, "We need to simplify the tax code." President Trump tweets from his phone, "Climate change is a hoax. Taxes are for losers." The tourist from Hong Kong, looking around at this chaotic scene, asks, "Is this the way policy is made in the United States?" The senator sighs and says, "Welcome to the United States." I should probably stop there. We're still debating whether the earth is round and if a flat tax is a good idea. So that's the overview. The Montreal Protocol. Now, in terms of international climate agreements, I think everyone in the world has heard of the Paris Agreement, but we should mention predecessors to the Paris Agreement. And I'll start with a success. The Montreal Protocol in 1987 was designed to protect the ozone layer by phasing out the production of numerous substances responsible for ozone depletion. As a result of the Montreal Protocol, the ozone hole has been slowly recovering. Climate projections indicate that the ozone layer will return to 1980 levels by 2040, regaining the protection of the ozone layer from the sun's UV radiation. While the Montreal Protocol did not establish a global carbon tax in the modern sense, it did involve financial mechanisms and incentives that effectively influenced the costs associated with depleting, with getting rid of ozone depleting substances. Now, in addition, some countries, and this is the bottom bullet point, and I'm kind of rushing through this slide because we've got so much to cover, but some countries have enacted ozone depleting substances such as chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs rather, and I wanted to show you a particular tax form. And I'm showing you a tax form because taxation ultimately comes down to forms submitted by taxpayers to government authorities. So this is the current IRS, US IRS tax form 6672. And some of these parts on the part 1 and part 2 of the form that don't have any arrows associated with them are for the another purpose. But on the part 3, part 4, part 5, and part 6, those are associated with ozone depleting chemicals. And you can see that there is a tax per ton in 2025 that goes as high as $188.50 per pound for halon. And that the reason that one's so high is that that's 10 times worse than the CFC chemicals. So these things are still happening, even though the Montreal Protocol happened years ago. And this particular international treaty was a success, I would say. Now, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was done in 1992, and it sets the ultimate objective of stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations. And I will be quoting directly from the convention here, wants to stabilize those greenhouse gas concentrations at a quote, at a level that would prevent dangerous human-induced interference with the climate system. Now, the Framework Convention was ratified by nearly all the countries in the world, giving it near universal recognition and legitimacy. The convention establishes some important principles, including common but differentiated responsibilities. This principle recognizes that while all countries have a responsibility to address climate change, developed countries should take the lead due to their historical contribution to greenhouse emissions. It also established the precautionary principle. That principle states that the lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing action when there is a threat of serious or irreversible damage. Now, the UN Framework Convention paved the way for subsequent agreements and protocols, such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement that we'll get into. It established key institutions that are still continuing and processes in the climate action area. These are the Conference of Parties. We hear that of Conference of Parties every year. Once a year, these things go on. The last one was in Baku. The next one's going to be in Brazil. I think the first one was in Berlin, and Angela Merkel was the chair of that particular Conference of Parties when she was then head of Germany's environmental department. So it sets up this sort of framework. There's a secretariat that's involved, and reporting requirements are the countries that have agreed to the Framework Convention need to report concerning their emissions and their actions to address climate change. Now, I should note that there has been and there continues to be considerable fear in the climate change community, especially in the United States, that not only will the United States under President Trump withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which he has done, but also withdraw from the UN Framework Convention. That, thank goodness, has not happened so far. The United States, as a party to the Framework Convention, is still required to report its emissions, even though it withdrew from the Paris Agreement. The way I read the convention, the reporting requirements of the Framework Convention are separate from the commitments of the Paris Agreement, and the United States is still, at this moment in time, a signatory to the 33-year-old UN Climate Convention. Now, the next slide provides, I just want to put things in context because the next slide provides just a visual of the countries with the highest carbon footprint. You can see at the top of the list is China. The United States is number 2, and India is number 3. If you take the European Union as a whole, then it becomes number 4. But Russia, this particular chart did not take the European Union as a sort of a juridical sort of presence, but instead on a country sovereign basis. And so Russia is 4, Japan 5, Germany 6, and it goes on. So you can see that the most important players in this in terms of the emissions at the moment, not the emissions to get us where we are today, but the emissions at the moment are China, the United States, and India. So the Kyoto Protocol is important because it established commitments by developed countries that actually ratified the protocol to limit and reduce greenhouse gases. Both China and India signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol. However, they were classified as developing countries under the protocol and thus did not have mandatory emissions reduction targets during the first commitment period, which was 2008 to 2012. The protocol was signed by President Clinton. You remember his vice president, Al Gore, continues to be a strong advocate for reducing greenhouse gases. It was actually signed by President Clinton, but it was not ratified in the US Senate because developing countries were not bound by the accord while developed countries were. And so the United States was sort of there, but didn't sign up. So, but nonetheless, the Paris Agreement, which was in 2015, and you probably, those of you that follow this will all recall the photographs of people raising their hand and being so happy about all of this, was done in 2015. It in effect superseded the Kyoto Protocol. It is a legally binding international treaty on climate change that sets a clear goal to limit. It's a goal, not a mandate, but a goal to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Now, a defining feature of the Paris Agreement compared with the Kyoto Protocol is that it commits developed and developing countries. I should go to the next slide. Commits developed and developing countries to publicly communicate nationally developed contributions, in NDCs for short. These represent the action that each nation agrees to take to meet its international obligations to reduce greenhouse gases. The nationally developed contributions are determined by each nation, and thus the method considers the status and development stage of the various parties. Now, this was the way to get an agreement. It was very, very hard to get an agreement. And so basically the agreement is everybody's going to seriously try to attain this goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and maybe 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. We will agree with that goal, but we will determine each on our own ways how to do it. And we will report that every 5 years. And every time we do this, we're going to ratchet it up so we have more strenuous things going in the future. And so this was the agreement. Now, as I say, Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement in January of this year. For the second time, he also did that the first time. But I want people to know that there is still widespread support in various quarters in the United States to support the Paris Agreement's goals. For example, Michael Bloomberg, a very successful entrepreneur as well as mayor of New York City, also ran for president of the United States, has agreed to cover the funding gaps of the U.S. funding resulting from the Trump administration's decision to withhold contributions to the United Nations. And I find that quite generous that he's doing it. He's sort of taking on a country role because of that. I should say he did that before the first time when Trump, and so he's doing it again. That said, even though there are strong people with strong support, very, very active, trying very hard to address this global problem, of which the United States is clearly a significant player at number 2 in the current list of emitters. That said, the withdrawal of the second largest emitter, like the United States, will weaken the global effort to combat climate change and has created uncertainty about international cooperation. And I should add, since it's such in the news as we speak, just like the uncertainty of his tariff actions have created a substantial uncertainty in the international realm. But that's why we in the seminar, if there's anybody watching this, we must keep up our efforts since money taxes are needed to continue on this existential work to mitigate the heating of the planet. So that gets us to taxes. While the Paris Agreement does not explicitly mandate specific taxes, it has significant implications for taxation policies around the world. The Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global warming requires substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and many countries are using carbon pricing mechanisms, including carbon taxes, as key policy tools to achieve these reductions. These countries determine their own nationally determined contributions and taxes and emissions trading systems play a part in these things. So they play a part in these national strategies. So if you will go, we'll go to the next slide, slide 10. Now this is a very, very busy slide. It is a map, a screenshot of the 2024 World Bank report on carbon pricing, and it shows how many countries around the world have already adopted or are in the process of adopting climate taxes and emission trading systems in order to put a price on carbon. The red color indicates those countries that have actually adopted a carbon tax per se. And you'll see Canada, for example, is broken up into its provinces. It's so large you can probably see that on this slide. So one province has adopted carbon tax, but this is an example because of all the colors. Because if you have a purple color, that's where you have emissions trading systems and carbon taxes implemented. And if you only have the emissions trading system implemented on this chart, like Germany in the middle of Europe there, you can see that has the ETS, the emissions trading system, implemented. And then the light purple color, if you look at India, for example, these are countries where carbon taxes or emissions trading systems are under consideration or under development. And so, again, this is taken from the World Bank, but it shows you how important these items are. And pointing out the United States, because that's where I was born, you'll see that the United States is mostly has no color and just a gray, no color at all. But if you look at California, Washington State, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, etc., you will also Colorado, you will see colors there because states are taking steps themselves to do things. So that goes back to my point that, you know, just because Trump has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, don't understand from that the United States is unified in that view. There's a very, very strong and clear view that we have to do things and we have to do things rationally. Now before I'll just leave it on this slide. Now before we go to the next slide, putting a price on carbon is founded on the notion of the social cost of carbon. As an aside, a core economic concept related to carbon taxation is the so-called Pigovian tax, which is named after a Cambridge economist, Arthur Pigot, working in the first half of the 20th century. The Pigovian tax, so it just shows you how long certain ideas have to take to get actually done. Just because we're not seeing instant results does not mean we should not continue on our goal of trying to think logically about these things and make suggestions and make good ideas. Because if you look at what Arthur Pigou did, he identified a problem, and now we see people have acted on it. And if you look at this chart, many places around the world are doing these things, not because he said it, but because it just makes sense. So the Pigovian tax is designed to correct a market failure caused by a negative externality, such as emissions of greenhouse gases. The optimal Pigovian tax should, in theory, be equal to the marginal social cost of the pollution, or in this case, the marginal damage caused by each ton of carbon dioxide emitted. So now, carbon taxes can be imposed either at the point of extraction or importation of the fossil fuel and measured by the carbon intensity of the fuel, or at the point of emissions when these energy sources are burned and greenhouse gases are emitted. Now, the latter is more accurate in terms of the underlying rationale for the carbon tax because you're actually measuring emissions. The former, based on fuel or the extraction or the importation of fossil fuels, that fits in more easily to existing fuel excise tax systems that are around the world, because almost every country that I'm aware of typically has a tax on gasoline, for example, as a fuel tax. And so the carbon tax can be more administrable if you do it on extraction or importation, because we already have systems that do this in large measure. Now, So I just want to say that the revenues for the governments can be used as general revenue, which is not really a great idea, I would suggest, but have more typically been used either further climate action, to invest in renewable energy, or provide relief to households because vulnerable populations will be affected by these costs. And that relief is sometimes referred to as the carbon tax dividend. Now, Sweden is one of the early countries that have adopted a carbon tax back in 1991. Canada has implemented a carbon pricing system with variations across the provinces. But very, very recently, April 1st, which is just 8 days ago, they removed the carbon tax on consumers, but the carbon tax pricing systems for large industrial emitters in Canada will continue to operate. I'll just jump down to the last bullet point here on this slide. Since it's in the region, Singapore's carbon tax rate started at $5 a ton of carbon CO2 and its equivalent, and is currently this year at 25 Singapore dollars per ton, and is scheduled to increase by up to $50 to $80 Singapore by 2030. So, emissions trading systems. Carbon taxation and emissions trading systems are distinct mechanisms, yet they both fall under the umbrella term carbon pricings, because they both aim to make emitters of greenhouse gases pay for the environmental damage they cause. Now, carbon tax directly sets the price of carbon, and emitters pay a fixed amount per ton of carbon released. And as I've noted on that previous slide, there's a range of countries with a range of different tax rates. Now, there are different types of, so that's one thing, carbon tax. Now, emissions trading systems, on the other hand, there are different types of emissions trading systems, but the typical one and that I'm going to talk about is the cap and trade system, whereby governments set a limit or a cap on the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted within a specified period. This cap represents the total allowable emissions from all the entities that are covered by the emissions trading system. Yeah, okay. So the governing body then distributes or auctions emission allowances to the companies or facilities covered by the emissions trading system. Each allowance permits the holder to emit up to a specific amount of greenhouse gases. Typically, these are done in terms of tons of carbon equivalent. So initially, when these things are set up, some allowances are given to companies for free in order to ease transition adjustments of such a system. And thereafter, allowances are sold through auctions, generating revenue for the government. Now, companies that reduce their emissions below their allocated level can sell surplus allowances to companies that exceed their limits. This then creates a market for emission allowances where the price is determined by supply and demand. Now, this particular system, emissions trading systems, requires monitoring, reporting, and verification systems to ensure the accuracy and credibility of the entire systems. Companies must accurately measure and report their emissions, and these reports have to be verified by independent auditors. Now, in the academic literature, the reason I'm talking about emissions trading systems in a tax talk is because in the academic literature, emissions trading systems and carbon taxation both share the term carbon pricing. And I've touched on this already, since both mechanisms have the fundamental objective of reducing greenhouse emissions by making greenhouse fuels more expensive. Now, while the coverage of carbon taxes and emissions trading systems has been continuously increasing, because the World Bank, for example, has done this chart for a number of years, and you will see over time more and more color on the chart when more and more countries either adopt or consider these carbon pricing mechanisms. So that while these systems have been continuously increasing and new initiatives are being developed, that is true, but from a Pagovian tax perspective, where you're trying to figure out how much it's going to take to actually address the damage that's caused, most of these carbon pricing instruments are not ambitious enough to drive the level of change required to meet the Paris Agreement's temperature goals. So it's good that we're doing all of this, but at low rates, it's not going to have the effect that the Paris Agreement temperature goals have been set. And I think we've already reached the temperature goals already. And in India, where I have been, the temperatures in parts of India have gotten over 50 degrees. And that's not human to live in 50-degree heat. Even with an umbrella walking around, I mean, it melts you. So, and Delhi's not, Sonipat, where Delhi is in the National Capital Region, Jindal Global University is located in Sonipat. And it's not the hottest place in India. It is still hot, very, very, very hot. So, in any event, so let's go on. I don't want to get depressed. So let's go on to the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. That World Bank chart that we looked at shows that if you look around the world, the European Union imposes amongst the highest carbon prices on greenhouse gas emissions. As a result of this, the European Union is implementing the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism to ensure a level playing field for EU manufacturers, and they do this by imposing a carbon price on imports to prevent carbon leakage. Because if you put together a product that's sold into the EU and you don't have any all of the carbon leakage is done in that country, and there's no cost on that, there's no change of behavior. There's just more and more production in places where you don't have these requirements. And so the European Union is putting the CBAM to ensure a level playing field to prevent carbon leakage and promote global emissions reductions. Now, under CBAM, a tariff, this is a tariff, and tariffs are very topical these days. A tariff is also a tax. Will start, the actual the tariff will start on January 1st, 2026, and it will be imposed on a limited number of items imported into the European Union, and they are carbon-intensive products, and they include iron and steel, cement, electricity, fertilizers, aluminum, and hydrogen. So this is not a everything sort of tariff. This is a specific limited tariff on products that are themselves carbon-intensive products. Now, a reporting of these things. There's a transition period that's been underway for a couple of years now, and importers of these products into Europe have been required to report to the European Union. This is an attempt to make the transition smooth when January 1st happens. This is quite a contrast on tariffs: limited, clear, transition period, far ahead, compared to what we've seen this week and last in the United States. Now, companies importing covered goods produced outside the European Union will have to purchase certificates equal to the greenhouse emissions generated producing those products outside of Europe. The European Commission will calculate the price of these certificates to reflect the average weekly price of the emissions trading system auction that they have in Europe, and thus these certificates will be pegged to the current emissions trading system market in Europe. This will ensure that the price of CBAM certificates are as close as possible to the price of emissions trading allowances, while also ensuring that the system remains manageable for administrative authorities. Now, there are exemptions to the CBAM tariffs, but they relate to military hardware. They're small value items. I don't see how steel could ever be a small value item. But I should also note that there are other countries that are considering CBAM at the moment. The UK plans to implement a CBAM in 2027. Canada, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Israel, Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, I should say, Colombia, Mexico, Vietnam, South Africa, and Brazil are all considering CBAM as well, because if you have a carbon tax or you have an emissions trading system and you don't impose a carbon mechanism adjustment, then you're allowing these activities to go elsewhere in the world with no cost imposed. So this is a leveling of the playing field. So let's go back to the United States. As I've been talking about before, carbon taxes and emissions trading systems, these are designed to impose cost on emitters. Actually, you have to pay to do something. If you're going to either pay a tax or buy an allowance. Now, the United States could do that, can do that, hasn't done that. But what we have done in the United States is, instead of imposing these taxes, we've gone in the opposite direction. we've decided, I shouldn't say, the US Congress has decided, this was the during the Biden administration in 2022, the Congress significantly expanded tax subsidies to accelerate the transition to low carbon economy. And these tax credits, tax subsidies are for both businesses and individuals. Now, I should note that there are entire law school courses taught in the United States about this particular topic, given the complexity involved and given the sums of money that are involved. But I'm not going to, and I've got a lot of words on this page, but what I want to sort of summarize is that these tax credits for businesses provide financial incentives for the development of and deployment of clean energy technologies like solar, wind, and energy storage. These tax credits can be transferred between taxpayers, and they can also be directly paid by the Treasury Department to certain entities like state and local governments or tribal governments or nonprofits, allowing these credits to receive a direct payment. Because if you're not a taxpayer, typically tax credits are not usable. And so this is a way to actually have these credits used and increase these hopefully activities to reduce climate change. Now, the amount of the credit can also be increased from its base amount, and it's a tax credit, can be increased by bonus credits if domestically produced components are used. And this particular provision, some of you may remember, was heavily criticized by foreign governments because they're saying, yeah, this violates all the trade agreements that we have, and also you're just pulling people into the United States by giving them money. But nonetheless, that was a part of it. There were also bonus credits could be given for locating projects in communities that have had a history of fossil fuel reliance. So if you had a community that was coal producing, so you had a lot of industry and economy was based on producing coal, if you shift away from coal, that's going to hurt the community there. And so you can get a bonus credit if you were to actually locate some of these activities in such a community. And that's just a sort of a little peek into the complexity of these things, because as taxpayers tend to be, they want maximum credits. And so they want to understand the entirety of all of these bonus credits and the best ways to take advantage of these credits. Now, I should note that there was one part of the Inflation Reduction Act under the Biden administration that did actually impose a tax, and that was a tax on methane emissions for certain oil and gas facilities, but that was very limited. I mean, a limited tax, but I mean, it is there, and it's something that you cannot say accurately that the United States only gives subsidies. They have actually enacted a methane fee. Now, for individuals, there are credits for that benefit individuals, particularly homeowners, as you can see on this slide. Those purchasing electric vehicles and so on. Now, one interesting point to make is that the original forecast of the losses attributable to the climate tax credits were in the range of $400 billion. And that has now been reassessed, and the forecast over a 10-year period is for more than $1 trillion of revenue tax loss by the take-up of these credits. Now, there's been much discussion in the Trump administration about repealing these tax credits because they can use this lost revenue, if you will, for other things, but it's not entirely clear whether there'll be support for this given members of Congress, including Republicans in Congress, who have facilities that are being built in their district under these subsidies. Now, we've been talking about tax subsidies, but to encourage the reduction of greenhouse gases. But no survey of climate change and taxation would be complete without mentioning negative tax subsidies or grants that encourage greenhouse gases. An example of this is the negative tax subsidy in the United States for oil depletion, which provides an incentive to drill for oil. Now, that's still in our law, or in the law of the United States. So another example closer to home is that there was the electricity subsidy for consumers here in Hong Kong. You could see it on your electricity bill when you get it, the little credit. So that's another example of the government doing something for a variety of different reasons, political reasons and so forth, that is a subsidy that's not, in the direction of limiting emissions, because if you give a credit for electricity, people are going to be more freely using electricity, and that causes climate emissions. This chart is an OECD chart that I just liked it because it sort of summarized so many things together, because you see that the cost would include excise taxes as well as carbon taxes and permit fees from emissions trading systems and so forth. But also those are increasing the cost of use of these things. But you also have negative costs, these pink parts of the chart, which would show these subsidies, negative subsidies. So, almost finished. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I've gone on so long. So, I started this lecture by saying that taxes are the levers that steer the economy. But there can be good taxes and there can be bad taxes. Not everything is good. For example, the negative tax subsidy would clearly, in this perspective, be a bad tax. But so I've taken a look at the guidance from the OECD and the IMF of tax principles. I've also, in our class in India, we've gone through very carefully the UN handbook for developing countries on developing carbon taxes and looked at their comments. And so I think that what we can sort of see as to what would be good carbon taxes, if that was our goal, and I think it should be, in my view, that these points align with the OECD, IMF, UN, and World Bank guidance. First, that they send a very clear, predictable, and stable price signal, unlike some who change tariffs every 5 minutes. I'm sorry, that's on top of mind. I cannot get away from what is happening. So broad coverage and comprehensive scope. Broad-based taxes minimize distortions. The UN says that emphasizes economy-wide approaches for maximum impact. Effective revenue recycling and use. Carbon tax revenue can be used to reduce distorting taxes, other taxes that distort things, invest in clean energy and climate resilience, provide targeted assistance to vulnerable populations. Likewise, administrative simplicity and efficiency should be designed to be administratively simple and efficient, minimizing compliance costs and bureaucratic burdens. Importantly, international coordination and harmonization, ideally is part of a coordinated, any carbon tax is part of a coordinated international effort to prevent carbon leakage and promote a level playing field across the world. Address regressive impacts on low-income households through targeted rebates and other forms of compensation. So a carbon tax should not just concern itself with the taxation of the carbon, it should also concern itself with what do you do with the revenue. And there should be clear reporting and monitoring of the carbon tax implementation. And so the negative side of this is what you would think. It's just the opposite. For example, unilateral implementation is not as good as harmonized international work. Having a complex system would be bad. Just using the revenue for general funds. Having narrow coverage, making it complicated, having exceptions so that people can somewhat game the system. All of these things would be bad. Not taking into account the burdens of low-income households would exacerbate social inequalities. And so, obviously, there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of work that can be done. There have been a lot of people that have thought about this very, very carefully. And I hope it's helpful that I've tried to pull together all of these materials to give an overview of climate change and taxation. I conclude my remarks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Archie. Really, given the complexity, listening to you speak and looking at the slides as well, I mean, initially they seem a bit daunting, but it's probably the most lucid overview I've ever heard of the basic mechanisms for controlling greenhouse gases. I mean, international and then localized, but also the taxation relationship to them. So personally, I'm very grateful to you for that. I've been making notes as I usually do, but I'll put these away and probably refer to them again. Now, I think currently we don't have any questions online, but
I wonder if there's anyone still watching.
Oh, I'm sure they'll be there. I'm sure they'll be there. In any event, I've got a couple of questions. Maybe I'll start off with one which is a little bit, I'm going to say, impertinent or a bit cheeky and a bit particular. And then if there's time, there's a couple of others I have. I was interested when you talked about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Okay, so, you know, quite rightly, when you explained it, you know, as I understand the principle is that some sort of assessment about the subsidies or, you know, the carbon, the bad greenhouse gas aspect of that production, which hasn't been accounted for in some way, and which gives the incoming product an advantage over products in the EU. Understand the principle, but I wonder, has anybody thought about in the EU? And let me say, you know, I can see that there's a strong argument that that's good, that's a sound principle, and so far this is a reasonable way to think about implementing or making it operational. But as you were speaking, I thought, hang on, the EU, just one of the jurisdictions, but in particular are going after Chinese electric vehicles, and they're imposing tariffs on them in order to decrease their saleability in the EU. So this seems to be a kind of reverse of the principle involved in the CBAM, because these vehicles, you know, putting aside arguments about whether there's been too much subsidising of their production, but these vehicles have one thing that comes into Europe, and if they were widely made available, would almost certainly tend to reduce the production of greenhouse gases. And I understand why they want to do this in order to protect the European car industry, I guess. Although paradoxically, it seems the main producers of cars, the Germans, are against this because they think there should be an open playing field because that's what suits them when they export so much. But has there been any discussion about these new tariffs on electric vehicles, and I suspect tariffs on solar panels and possibly wind-powered equipment? How do you mesh this with carbon border adjustment mechanism?
Yeah, that's a very good observation. I think that if you just get your mindset around what can we do to minimize greenhouse gases, that leads you to certain sort of results. But then when you take into account the fact that if countries actually implement those policies, as the European Union has done, and other countries don't, what do we do about that? And so that's the reason for the CBAM, because trying to get the level playing field again. But then you have this, as you say, this effect of the fact that you were possibly importing products that would actually achieve the goal of climate reduction. And these things are an example of having multiple considerations on the same topic. And it's just it's a balancing act at the end of the day. And it's all within the framework of political institutions and political screaming and pushing and shoving and deliberations and rationales. So you come out with these systems that, as you point out, can be conceptually conflicting, but at the same time, if you just look at one thing, they make sense. So but that's life is full of those kind of arrangements, But I mean, it's a good observation. What you would need to have is some sort of ordering mechanism, sort of saying so if we're going to impose, remember the CBAM is imposed on steel, the enumerated items, fertilizers, cement, and so forth. The cars don't receive a CBAM because they're not. There is the question of what the content of the cars, if they're made of aluminum and so forth. Does that affect? But the CBAM is essentially focused on the bigger, heavy industries, and there is a discussion that has just begun about trying to get those countries that have adopted in emissions trading systems and carbon taxes to all enact CBAMs on heavy industry, just heavy industry. In order to have a coalition of the willing of countries that would go, in a global basis after this particular aspect, and then that would then sort of over time generalize these costs throughout various economies, and then you would still have the more normal tariffs that you'd have, protection, consumer protection, industrial protection of that you're talking about of these cars. So all of this is interactive. Everything in life is interactive and very complicated. But that's not an answer.
Yeah, well, anyhow, good food for thought. I think. I suppose if I were working in this area, I'd just finish on this point, and I'm advocating for CBAM. I might well have thought of this, and then I would think, I can deal with this by just not talking about things that give rise to awkward questions. And there's a legitimate reason to do it as well, as you say, to focus on these heavy industry produced items.
Right, there are only six items on the list.
Yeah. So I guess that makes sense. Well, look, I think we have maybe time for one more question. And I really wanted to call on your experience. It's not often, in fact, we've never had, I think certainly not right here in Hong Kong, somebody speaking in this series who has had experience both living and teaching in India. And you know Hong Kong well and China well also. So one of the arguments I hear made by reasonable people and others who are a bit more hostile, a bit like, what can I say, with the Trump tilt, that you just forget about all of this attempt to use regulation to control greenhouse gases, because China and India are just going to produce so much in terms of greenhouse gases as they grow, that what the rest of us can do in the developed world is not going to have much impact. Silly argument in my view, but nevertheless it's made. But my focus would therefore be on the reality seems to be that India will continue to develop hugely as an industrialized power, and will need an immense amount of electricity to do this. And China still needs apparently yet more and more electricity to do what it wants to do over the next 20 years or so. So given those sort of realities, and I'm not looking for a magic wand solution, but in jurisdictions like India and China, it's limited what tax can do, I guess, tax regulation can do. But do you have any specific thoughts about, well, take India for an example, what role taxation can play in trying to mitigate or at least reduce the bad impact of this massive industrial development which is coming?
Right. Well, I mean, if you look at the emissions from India, I think if I had to pick one thing that I could change, I had the power of everything, it would be that they convert dirty coal as the source of electric plants into cleaner fuel. Right. So if you could do that one thing, get rid of the coal burning plants and go to gas. Gas is so much cleaner. I mean, it's still a fossil fuel, but it's so much cleaner. That would be a tremendous step that could be taken by India. The problem is it costs so much money to change these plants. And so from a tax perspective, and of course, before I get to the tax, the Indian government takes the view, understandably so, and I'm very sympathetic to this point. They did not create this problem over the years. It's the United States, it's the Englands, it's the Europeans. It's not us. We didn't do this. We're at the end of it, but we don't have a lot of money. We're using coal, and so they make that very legitimate point. And then also when you look at it on a per capita basis, given the fact that they're the most populous country in the world, their CO2 emissions on a per person basis is still low. So they will make all those arguments. And they will also argue that the current fuel taxes that they have are equivalent to carbon taxes. I have some conceptual problems with that, but I'll leave that to the side. But given the fact that these coal-powered electricity plants, from what I understand and what I've read and what I experience when I breathe there, if we could change that, the tax should be both, we should have both tax incentives and tax penalties, tax cost imposed, so that they would hopefully pay for one another, but granted to different parts of that community, so that there could be capital to make these changes. Now it's going to take a long time, and I should readily acknowledge that the Indian government is attempting to take these types of steps of minimizing their coal-powered electricity plants. But if there was one thing I could change, it would be to focus on those coal-powered plants. That would make a big difference to the life in India.
Yeah, well,
Because when you go, when you're there and during, not the rainy season, when the rain flushes it through, the air is cleaner. When there's a lot of pollution, it can be unpleasant.
well, that's I can see the focus there is. I mean, it's a huge problem, as you say, but there is a really sharp focus there, and as a step by step, it's very good. Thank you, Archie. Usually we do a bit of this, but we should have a button we could press. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.